Have you ever opened your phone just to check the time and ended up somewhere completely different? Scrolling through someone else's life, their new job, their wedding photos, their announcement that finally, the thing you've been praying for happened to them, and something in your chest tightens. Just a little. A quiet ache you don't say out loud because it feels petty to admit. But it's there. That small sinking thought. I should be further along by now. Maybe it's a career you thought you'd have, a relationship you thought would have started, or ended, or healed by now. A dream you used to talk about with excitement, and now you can barely bring yourself to mention it. Because saying it out loud means admitting how long it's been sitting there, untouched. We live in a world that hands us a stopwatch the moment we're born and tells us everyone else is already running. Milestones by 25, success by 30, everything figured out by 40. And if you haven't hit the marks, if your life doesn't look like the version scrolling past you on a screen, the world quietly suggests that you're behind, that you're losing, that the clock is not your friend, but your judge. But here's something worth sitting with, just for a moment. What if that entire premise is wrong? What if time was never meant to be a race at all? Because there is another way of understanding time, an ancient one, far older than notifications and comparison feeds. It's the way Scripture speaks about time, not as a track you sprint down, competing for a finish line, but as a garden, something that is tended, something that grows in seasons, not deadlines, something where waiting is not wasted time. It's working time, happening beneath the surface, where you can't always see it. And if you've ever felt like you're waiting on something that seems to be taking far too long, a breakthrough, a healing, a calling you can feel but can't yet name, I want to tell you about a man who understood that ache better than almost anyone in history. He was given a promise, a specific one, something enormous, the kind of promise that reshapes an entire life. And then nothing happened, not for years, not for a decade, not even for 2 decades. He watched the season for that promise seem to pass. He watched his own body age past the point where the promise even seemed physically possible anymore. He had every reason, by any human measuring stick, to conclude that he had missed his moment, that the door had closed, that he was, simply, too late. His name was Abraham, and what happened to him, the way his story actually unfolds, the timing behind it, the reason God waited as long as he did, will change the way you look at every single year you feel like you've lost. Because behind Abraham's story is a principle, a pattern woven through nearly every major figure in Scripture. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it, not in the Bible, and not in your own life either. Let's walk through it together. To understand Abraham's story, we have to go back to the very beginning of it, to a moment in the book of Genesis, where God makes him a promise that, on paper, sounds almost impossible. Abraham, then still called Abram, was 75 years old. Let that number sit for a second. 75, an age where most people in his time, and honestly in ours too, are winding down, not starting over. And yet at 75, God tells him to leave everything he knows, his homeland, his father's house, everything familiar, and go to a place he would show him later. Not now, later. And attached to that call was a promise. Abraham would become the father of a great nation. His descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, as the sand on the seashore. His name would be blessed, and through him, the whole world would be blessed. There was just one enormous problem. Abraham had no children, and his wife, Sarah, was already unable to conceive, something the text is honest about, right from the start. So here is a man being told he will father a nation, at an age where fatherhood already seemed to be closing, married to a woman who could not have children in the first place. If you were standing next to Abraham that day, you might have quietly wondered if he'd misheard something. But Abraham went anyway. He packed up his life and he went. And then, the waiting began. Not a short waiting. Not the kind of pause before a green light. Genesis tells us that Abraham was 86 when he had his first son, Ishmael, through Sarah's servant, Hagar. A decision born out of impatience, out of trying to help the promise along because the waiting had become unbearable. But that wasn't the promised son. God was clear. The promise would come through Sarah herself. So the waiting continued. Abraham turned 90. Sarah was pushing 90 herself. And still, nothing tried to imagine what that felt like from the inside. Not from the outside, where we already know how the story ends. But from the inside, in real time, the way Abraham actually lived it. 15 years since the promise was made. Then 20, the most fertile years of his life, gone. His body aging in ways that made the promise seem more and more like something he'd imagined, or misunderstood, or simply lost. Can you relate to that feeling? Watching a window of opportunity that once felt wide open slowly seem to narrow, year after year, wondering if you heard your own calling wrong? Wondering if the version of your life you hoped for already quietly expired somewhere behind you, and no one told you? Abraham had every reason to believe that. And yet Scripture gives us this remarkable detail. In Romans, centuries later, the Apostle Paul reflects back on Abraham's waiting, and writes that Abraham did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong in faith, fully persuaded that God was able to do what he had promised. Not because Abraham had proof. He had none. He had only years of silence and a body working against him. But something in him held on anyway. And then, finally, Genesis tells us Abraham was 100 years old, and Sarah was 90. When their son Isaac was born, 100 years old. Not 30, not 50, 100. Why? Why would God wait that long? Why let a man carry a promise for 25 years before fulfilling it? Long enough for hope to nearly die. Long enough for the impatience-born detour with Hagar to happen. Long enough for Abraham's body to move well past the point of natural possibility. That question, the why behind the waiting, is where this story stops being ancient history and starts becoming something for you. Here's the first thing worth noticing about the 25 years Abraham waited. They were not empty. They only looked empty from the outside. During that stretch of silence, Abraham wasn't standing still. He was becoming someone. Genesis shows us a man who, during those waiting years, learned to build altars in unfamiliar places, to worship in the middle of uncertainty, not just after it resolved. He rescued his nephew Lot from a coalition of kings, a story of courage and decisiveness. He negotiated with God on behalf of strangers, pleading for the city of Sodom, showing a heart that had grown wide enough to intercede for people who weren't even his own family. He learned to trust a voice he could not see, in a land that was not his own, with no map except a promise. In other words, the waiting years were formation years. God wasn't simply making Abraham wait for a son. God was shaping the kind of man who would be equipped to raise that son, to pass down not just a family line, but faith. 100-year-old Abraham was not the same man who left his homeland at 75. 25 years of walking with God, in the middle of unanswered longing, had refined him. This is the part our modern minds tend to skip past, because we're trained to see waiting as dead time. Time where nothing is happening. Time we're losing. Time slipping through our fingers while everyone else moves forward. But Scripture consistently paints a different picture. Waiting, in the biblical sense, is rarely passive. It's rarely empty. It is, more often than not, the very mechanism by which we are being prepared for what we're waiting for. Think of it this way. If Abraham had received Isaac at 75, in the exact moment the promise was spoken, would the story carry the same weight? Would it point so unmistakably to God's power, rather than human timing, human biology, human effort? Part of the reason the promise came at 100, when it was, by every natural measure, impossible, is so that no one could ever say Abraham and Sarah pulled this off on their own. The delay wasn't God being slow. The delay was God making sure the outcome could only be explained one way. There's a psychological concept modern researchers have studied that echoes this ancient pattern almost exactly. It's sometimes called delayed gratification, most famously explored through experiments where children were offered a small reward now, or a larger reward if they could wait. The children who learned to tolerate the discomfort of waiting, who could sit with unmet desire without giving up or grabbing the lesser prize early, consistently showed stronger outcomes years later, not just in achievement, but in emotional regulation, in relationships, in overall well-being. But here's the deeper layer researchers point to less often. What actually helps someone wait well isn't willpower alone. It's meaning. A child who believes the reward is real and worth it waits differently than a child who suspects they've been forgotten. The waiting becomes bearable when it feels connected to something. Not empty time, but time in service of something coming. That's exactly what Abraham had to hold on to. Not certainty about the calendar, certainty about the character of the one who made the promise. And that distinction, trusting the promise giver rather than the timeline, is where we start to find something you can actually carry into your own life. Because chances are, your waiting isn't about a child, or a nation, or an ancient covenant. Your waiting has its own shape, and it deserves its own honest look. So let's bring this a little closer to where you actually live. Maybe your version of waiting is watching a job you were promised, or one you know you're qualified for, go to someone else, again and again, while you keep refreshing the same job boards, wondering what's wrong with your resume, or your luck, or you. Maybe it's watching friends get married, start families, buy homes, while you're still waiting for a relationship to even begin. And every wedding you attend feels less like a celebration and more like a quiet reminder of a life you don't have yet. Maybe it's a dream you've carried since childhood. The business, the book, the ministry, the creative work you know you were made for. And you've done everything right. You've shown up, you've tried, and still, the door hasn't opened. And the longer it stays closed, the more you start to wonder if you misheard your own calling completely. Or maybe it's something quieter than any of that. Not a single dramatic disappointment, but the slow accumulation of ordinary years, turning 30, then 35, then 40, and realizing the life you pictured for yourself at this age looks nothing like the one you're actually living. And nobody prepares you for how heavy that particular kind of grief can feel. Grieving a version of your life that never even existed, except in your own expectations. Here is the quiet cruelty of comparison in the age we live in. It doesn't just show you what other people have. It shows you a highlight reel, stripped of struggle, stripped of waiting, stripped of the 25 hidden years behind their one visible moment. You see someone's Isaac, you don't see their 75 to 100. You don't see the detours, the doubts, the nights they wondered if they'd misunderstood everything. And so the comparison isn't even fair to begin with. You're measuring your unfinished middle against someone else's edited highlight. And of course, it feels like you're behind. You're not comparing two timelines. You're comparing your raw footage to someone else's trailer. This is where the biblical view of time offers something genuinely different from the cultural one. Culture says, time is scarce, time is a competition. And if you haven't achieved X by a certain age, you've lost ground you can never get back. Scripture says something quieter, and honestly, something sturdier. God is not bound by your calendar, and He does not measure your worth by your pace. There's a phrase used elsewhere in Scripture, the idea that there is a time for every purpose under heaven. Not one universal time for everyone's purpose. A time for your purpose. Which means the season someone else is in, the timeline someone else is walking, was never meant to be the measuring stick for yours in the first place. Abraham's 100 years was not a delay by comparison to someone else's 20. It was simply Abraham's own timeline, shaped by Abraham's own formation, for Abraham's own purpose. You are not behind a schedule that was never actually yours to keep, that single reframe. Trading a shared, competitive timeline for your own particular one doesn't make the waiting disappear. But it does change what the waiting means. And that shift in meaning is often the very thing that makes waiting survivable. Let's look at what it actually looks like to wait well. Because Abraham didn't wait perfectly, and that too is something worth learning from. It would be easy, telling Abraham's story, to leave out the messy middle, to make it sound like he waited 25 years with perfect unwavering peace, never doubting, never faltering, simply trusting quietly until the promise arrived. But that's not what happened. And honestly, that's part of why his story is so useful to us. Remember Hagar. 10 years into the promise, when Sarah was still unable to conceive, she offered her servant Hagar to Abraham so that he might have a child through her instead. A practice not uncommon in that culture, but still, at its core, an attempt to manufacture the promise on a human timeline, rather than trust God's. Abraham agreed. Ishmael was born, and for a while, it may have even felt like relief, like the waiting was finally over, but it wasn't the promise. It was a detour, and that detour created real pain. Tension in the household, heartbreak for Hagar, complicated family dynamics that echo through the rest of the biblical narrative and beyond. This matters, because it tells us something important. Even a man Scripture holds up as a model of faith struggled with waiting. He didn't always wait with quiet trust. Sometimes he waited with anxious improvising, trying to force an outcome because the stillness had become unbearable. And Scripture doesn't hide that from us. It shows us a real, flawed, tired human being, not a flawless saint who never doubted. Which means, if you have ever tried to rush your own promise, taken the relationship that wasn't quite right because you were tired of being alone, said yes to the job that wasn't quite aligned because you couldn't stand watching the calendar anymore, made the impatient decision that complicated things later, you are not disqualified from the story of faithful waiting. You are, in a strange way, right in the middle of it. Abraham did that too. And God's promise to him didn't evaporate because of it. That's worth sitting with. God's faithfulness to Abraham was not contingent on Abraham waiting perfectly. It was contingent on God's own character, a character that remained steady even while Abraham's patience wavered. There's a psychological insight worth pairing with this. Something researchers who study resilience often point out. People don't actually need to feel calm the entire time they're waiting for something meaningful. What predicts long-term well-being isn't the absence of doubt or frustration during hard seasons. It's whether a person has what's sometimes called a coherent narrative about their struggle. In simpler terms, whether they can tell a story about their waiting that makes sense, that has meaning, rather than a story that feels random and cruel. Abraham's waiting had a coherent narrative, even in its messiest chapters, not because he handled it flawlessly, but because he kept returning to trust after every detour. He built another altar. He kept walking. He didn't let the Hagar chapter become the whole story. And maybe that's the real invitation here. Not to wait without ever doubting, without ever making an anxious detour of your own, but to keep returning, to let your unfinished, imperfect waiting still be part of a story that has meaning, rather than deciding the detour disqualifies you from the promise altogether. Because the promise was never about Abraham's perfection, and whatever you're waiting for was never about yours either. There's a detail in Abraham's story that's easy to rush past, but it changes everything once you notice it. The promise wasn't just about Abraham. It was never meant to end with him. When God first spoke to Abraham, the promise wasn't simply, "You will have a son." It was that through him, all the families of the earth would be blessed. Isaac wasn't the finish line. Isaac was the beginning of something that would stretch far beyond Abraham's own lifetime. A lineage, a nation. And eventually, in the way Christian tradition reads the story, a thread that leads all the way to Christ himself. Which means Abraham never actually got to see the full scope of what his waiting produced. He held his son. He watched Isaac grow into a young man, but he did not live to see the nation. He did not live to see the descendants as numerous as the stars. He died still trusting a promise that was only partially fulfilled in his own lifetime, trusting that the rest would unfold long after he was gone. Sit with that for a moment, because it's easy to miss how remarkable it is. Abraham waited 25 years for a son, and the son was real and precious and worth every year of waiting. But the son was also just the first visible piece of something far bigger than Abraham could ever witness firsthand. This is where the biblical view of time diverges most sharply from how we tend to measure our own lives. We want to see the whole outcome. We want proof in our own lifetime, on our own timeline, that the waiting was worth it. We want the harvest to come while we're still standing in the field. But Scripture again and again shows people planting seeds they will never see fully grown. Moses leading a generation toward a promised land he himself would not enter. Prophets speaking of a coming Messiah they would not live to see. Faithful men and women remembered as having died without receiving the promises, but having seen them from a distance. There's something quietly freeing in that, if you let it land. Your worth and the meaning of your waiting is not measured only by whether you get to see the full outcome in your own lifetime. Some of what you're planting right now, the character you're building through this hard season, the faith you're practicing in the silence, the way you're choosing to keep showing up even without proof, some of that may bear fruit far beyond what you can currently imagine, in your own life down the road, in the lives of people you love, in ways you may never fully trace back to this exact season of waiting. This doesn't mean your specific hope won't happen in your lifetime. Often, like Abraham's, it does. But it does mean the value of this season isn't only found in the eventual arrival. It's also found in who you're becoming while you wait, and in the quiet, invisible ways that becoming ripples outward. Abraham couldn't see all of that from where he stood. He only had the son in front of him, and the memory of 25 hard, faithful years behind him. But we can see it, looking back, the fuller shape of what his waiting actually built. And that gives us a question worth asking about our own waiting. Not just when will this happen, but who am I becoming while it hasn't yet? So where does that leave you, practically? Because it's one thing to find Abraham's story beautiful, and another thing entirely to know what to actually do with your own waiting. On an ordinary Tuesday, when the promise still hasn't come, and the comparison ache still shows up the moment you open your phone. Here is the first shift worth making. Stop measuring your waiting against someone else's timeline, and start asking what this season is forming in you. Not as a way of pretending the waiting doesn't hurt, it does, and it's allowed to, but as a way of reclaiming the time, rather than experiencing it as something simply being taken from you. Ask yourself honestly, what am I learning right now that I could only learn in this specific kind of hard? What kind of patience? What kind of compassion? What kind of quiet strength is being built in me during this stretch that I would not have access to if the answer had come easily or early? This doesn't require pretending to feel grateful for pain you didn't choose. It simply means staying curious about what the waiting might be building, rather than only cataloging what it's costing you. The second shift, let go of the detour shame. If you've already made an impatient decision, your own version of Hagar, some choice made out of exhaustion rather than trust, you are not disqualified. Abraham wasn't. The promise didn't require a flawless waiter. It only required someone who kept returning to trust after every wrong turn. So if you need to return today, return. That's not failure. That's exactly the pattern Scripture shows us over and over. The third shift, build your altars in the meantime. For Abraham, that meant literal worship in unfamiliar places, marking moments of trust even in the middle of uncertainty. For you, it might look different, but the principle holds. Don't wait for the promise to arrive. Before you practice gratitude, before you invest in your relationships, before you take care of your body and your faith and your peace. Build the life you actually want to be living while you wait for the specific thing you're waiting for. Abraham didn't put his whole life on pause for 25 years. He kept living, kept building, kept showing up for the people around him, even while the one specific promise remained unfulfilled. And the fourth shift, maybe the most important one, remember that delay is not denial. Abraham's promise didn't arrive on his schedule. It arrived on a schedule that made its impossibility unmistakable, so that when it finally came, there was no question about where it came from. Your timeline may look nothing like you expected either. But a promise delayed in Scripture is almost never a promise canceled. It's a promise still being prepared, for you, and often through you, for reasons you may not be able to see yet. You are not behind. You are never in the same race as the people you keep comparing yourself to. You are in your own field, in your own season, being formed for a harvest that has not missed its timing, because it was never running on anyone else's clock to begin with. Let's return, for a moment, to that scene we opened with. You, scrolling, watching someone else's milestone light up your screen, that familiar tightness settling into your chest. I want you to imagine sitting with that feeling now, but with different information than you had before. Because now you know something about what's usually hidden behind the moment you're seeing. You know that behind every visible arrival, the wedding, the promotion, the launch, the breakthrough, there is very likely a quiet stretch of years that never made it into the post. A private 25 years, in one shape or another. Doubt nobody saw, detours nobody mentioned, nights of wondering if the promise had simply passed them by. You're not comparing your whole story to theirs. You're comparing your visible middle to their invisible ending. And once you see that clearly, the comparison starts to lose some of its grip. Not because you no longer care about your own timeline, but because you realize the timeline you are measuring against was never the real picture in the first place. There's a quiet kind of peace available here, if you're willing to receive it. Not the peace of having your answer already. Not the peace of knowing exactly when your waiting will end. But the peace of trusting that waiting, in the biblical pattern, is so rarely wasted, even when it feels aimless, even when it feels like nothing is happening beneath the surface. Think again of the garden image from earlier. No farmer stands over a planted field, panicking because the seed hasn't visibly grown after 1 week. They know, Because they've learned to trust the nature of growing things. That root systems form underground, invisible, long before anything breaks the surface. The most important part of the growing season is often the part no one can see at all. You are, quite possibly, in your own underground season right now. Not stuck, not forgotten, not behind, rooting. And if Abraham's story tells us anything, it's that the God who makes promises is not intimidated by long timelines, aging bodies, impossible circumstances, or seasons that seem to stretch far past what feels reasonable. In fact, Scripture seems to suggest the opposite, that God often lets the natural window close entirely before he moves, precisely so that no one could ever mistake the outcome for coincidence, timing, or human effort. Whatever you are waiting for, the relationship, the child, the healing, the calling, the breakthrough that keeps slipping past its expected date, consider the possibility that the delay is not evidence you've been forgotten. It may be evidence of exactly the opposite, that something is being prepared with a level of care that simply cannot be rushed. You're not behind. You're being formed for the specific harvest only your season can grow. So let's come back, one final time, to that moment on your phone, the scroll, the milestone that isn't yours, the quiet tightening in your chest. The next time it happens, and it will happen again, because comparison has a way of finding us, even after we've understood it clearly. I want you to remember Abraham. Not the man with descendants like the stars, not the finished story you already know the ending to. Remember him at year 15, at year 20, watching his body age past the point of possibility, holding a promise that looked, by every human measure, expired. Remember that his waiting wasn't wasted. It was working, underground, in ways he couldn't see and wouldn't fully understand until long after most of it was over. Remember that he didn't wait perfectly, that he had his own Hagar, his own impatient detour, and that the promise held anyway, because it was never resting on his perfection to begin with. Remember that he never saw the whole outcome. He only ever saw the first seed. The rest he trusted without proof, to a timeline far larger than his own eyes could follow. And remember this, most of all, you were never behind. You were never in a race with the people whose highlight reels keep interrupting your ordinary Tuesday. You are in your own field, on your own timeline, being prepared for a harvest that has never once missed its season, because it was never running on anyone else's clock. Whatever you are waiting for right now, take a breath and let it be unhurried. Let this season do its quiet work. Build your altars in the meantime. Return to trust every time you drift from it. And trust that the God who kept a promise for 100 years is not in any danger of forgetting yours. You are not late. You are not behind. You are exactly where your story needs you to be right now. Rooting, growing, becoming, right on time.